Hello and welcome to another episode of Taking the Stand, and we are looking. I can't remember if I made this joke last time, but we're looking forward to putting the stand back. But anyhow, so welcome to Taking the Stand, where we look here at FAN at justice and how justice should be about freedom, and if justice isn't about freedom, well, then we're off to the races. Then we're in the reeds, and then it is time for you, dear viewer, dear citizen, dear fan, freedom fanatic, to take the stand with us, to make sure that you assert your rights and you demand your freedoms. I can't remember who said it, but it's a useful quote to think that a right is only as strong as the demand of the citizenry for that right. You have a right to justice, and if justice isn't about freedom, it's not justice at all. I am joined again by the wonderful Sara Gon, the big chief, the big cheese, the tribal leader, the chairman Mao of Don't Educate, Don't Indoctrinate, an organization, an entity that is taking aim at racism in schools. And Sara, if I is that a fair introduction? I especially like the chairman Mao bit.
No, it's very fair. I mean, I take no prisoners, but I'm also the only employee of Idonti, so you can put whatever appellation you like onto that one.
I must say, well, if that is the case, which I must say it probably is, then all strength to your arm. In fact, all strength to both of your arms, because you are faced with quite a challenge, and a challenge that FAN shares to an extent, because the FAN Justice Project is all about justice, and Idonti is about confronting what is called social justice, but actually is something far from it. Now, in the first episode of this social justice series, we looked at what's the difference. Last week, we had a bit of a perspective as to why it is a conversation that needs to be had in South Africa. And I thought this week we can really drill down into particulars, we've gone from definition through to theory, through to historical significance. But now this is where the tire touches the tar, to look at right. If we're going to speak about justice and capital S social, capital J justice, and compare it to actual, just and equitable social treatment, what are we looking at? From Idonti's side, what have you encountered along these lines of social justice wreaking, let's say, mild or perhaps less than mild havoc?
Okay. Just to remind that Idonti, Educate, Don't Indoctrinate, is our name, is our website, and it's aimed specifically at educating parents, teachers, and kids about critical race theory in schools. Because one of the most pernicious thing about critical race theory in schools is the obvious thing, is that you're training, educating children. And, the Marxists know that the sooner you get a child under your wing, the more you can indoctrinate them. And in fact, to some extent, we liken a lot of the techniques they use to the techniques of cults, but that's a different discussion altogether. We have been going very long, so we don't have a sort of vast amount to call on, but we have started to perceive a pattern. Now, most of the CRT that occurs in schools occurs in private schools. And I'll explain why this makes sense. And then the next grouping are good, very high quality public schools. And I think very often there'll be schools who will play the same sports against each other. In other words, that makes sense that they're put together in one way or the other. But what tends to happen, and it goes something like this: so a child or some children complain of an act of discrimination or racism, more specifically racism. The management of the school gets to know about it and starts to panic and get concerned that they are not handling the case properly. They then go to probably other schools or other organizations who've dealt with this before, who recommend consultants who, for a significant amount of money, come in and they apply the ideology and the processes of critical race theory to making the children more understanding, better understand race, better understand racism. But I'm not sure it does very much for race relations, which is, to me, the only thing that really matters. So that tends to be the pattern of how they get, of what we're perceiving of how they get into schools. We're now starting to see that sort of educational organizations are playing a role, but we've got to flesh that out a little bit more still.
So, complaint from instance, which might be usually a child, which, I mean, let's be fair, which might be an actual instance of racism. I mean, for no moment are we denying racism. It's just how do you actually solve it? So it's complaint, panic from school as to what to do, perhaps an oversensitivity to the fact that, you know, perceptions about race is so dominant in South African media discourse that this school, really looking at other schools, don't want to go down that route. Yeah. So then they identify this, you know, savior industry that seems to be developing about individuals that come to a school and, you know, drop some knowledge or, you know, share lived experience. And now, I think a very telling thing about non-racialism is you treat people as, you know, non-racial entities. You don't think that you're just, you know, some limb of a group.
Yeah, well, in other words, you treat people as people, not as the color of the people. The color is not.
What a radical idea. Yes. So then assuming if these people are opposed to racism, they come to these schools to help them with racism or to help them work against racism, I'm assuming at that point it would be madness and utter lunacy to then say, to help you with racism, I'm going to divide you into groups of black kids and white kids. Surely that's not the next step.
Oh, but it is. And what usually happens, and this is very much in the CRT mold, there isn't always a division, but our experience suggests that when the consultant comes in to talk to the pupils about anti-racism, and I will talk a bit about that, they very often do. They divide the groupings up, and they will talk to the black kids. Now, I have to say up front, I don't know what they necessarily say to the black kids, but I can hazard a guess, because the reports don't tend to come from the black parents. They come from the white parents, where the kids are addressed by a consultant who teaches them about their white privilege, their white fragility, the fact that they come from an oppressor group and they are inherently oppressors, and that it is coming to terms with this and acknowledging it and apologizing for it, perhaps, in order to right the wrongs of the felt by the black kids who are encouraged to see themselves as victims. Now, as you say, that's not to deny that there were oppressive whites and their blacks haven't been victims. But what you're doing is you're casting upon people that you don't know thoughts and behaviors that you don't know they have. You're assuming they have them by something as facile as the color of their skin. And so essentially our concern, and this is why our parents come to us and they are concerned, is that they've got the kids going home and saying, I feel like I'm being bullied, or I'm very uncertain, I'm afraid to open my mouth, etc. Because what you've now done is you've empowered the victimhood grouping, and you've disempowered the victimizer grouping. And particularly cool kids at school level, empowerment and disempowerment, hot stuff, And it's to my mind, if you want to improve race relations, you bring people together. You do not separate them, and you do not accuse them of anything on either side. You don't encourage victimhood, and you don't chastise people for being victimizers that at the age of 13 they could not possibly have been. I think that to me is what is so unattractive about critical race theory, and also the fact that in America it's a concept that's developed from the history of slavery in America, and the descendants of slaves who've ended up in a situation where they less than 15% of the population. Here, whites are less than 10% of the population, and you have the very real risk of the tyranny of the majority being visited upon the minority. So, although we've had a terrible history, I would not for a second choose critical race theory as a way to improve race relations.
And I think this is perhaps one of the most toxic things about this push for a very specific type of social justice, of which critical race theory, through things like Black Lives Matter, and Black First, Land First, these sorts of movements really get pushed to the fore. The core evil here is that you're going to a child, a 13, 14, impressionable young kid, unsure of the world, unsure of themselves, as I think most kids of that age are, and then told either how weak they are or how evil they are, based on what people that happen to look somewhat like them did in another space, in another time. And that's where it's sort of, you've got such a clear example of capital S, capital J, social justice, just ignoring one of the foundational elements of justice, and that is you are responsible for your deeds. If you committed an injustice, that's on you, my friend, not on anyone else. And it seems social justice, critical race theory, turns that idea of justice, just 180 in the wrong direction.
Well, you see, one of the problems with CRT, I mean, the idea of, we spoke before about social justice versus justice, but one of the problems with CRT is the inversion of language. So social justice is neither social nor is it justice. It's I can't think of a better way of saying it. Anti-racism, by implication, means you are against racism, but anti-racism here means you will essentially develop one group of kids in one way and another group of kids another way. There is no equality. There is shame on the one side and there is entitlement on the other. So they don't use the word equality. They use the word equity, which means they used to mean you don't have equality of opportunity. You have equality of outcomes. Now, how on earth do you create an equality of outcomes? It's a phony. It's phony because it also ignores the other side of the humanity you're dealing with, and that is whatever groups people may fall into, they are actually individuals with individual aspirations, individual talents, individual abilities, individual resources. It's not to say the whole idea of equality of opportunity is to try and give more resources to those who don't have, to give them a better chance of reaching equitable outcomes. But it's not, you and I are not each other. And that's what's so weird about CRT.
And I'm sure your husband is very relieved.
Completely.
But so I must say that this perniciousness of the inversion of language does really cut to this idea of being taught things, being communicated things that are true or things that are useful. In Idanti's experience of, you've been going for, I think, a month or two, and already you've received parents, complaints from parents, teachers, and school kids about, this happening to them. This inversion of language specifically, why don't they use terms like non-racial anymore? I mean, non-racial is, according to the CRT advocates, a far right-wing, white racist idea. But correct me if I'm wrong, it's in the damn South African Constitution. It's an aspirational value that our country was founded on.
You see, what you're doing is, because you're creating a relatively new theory, and the concepts of non-racialism and equality and equality of opportunity are what you're actually railing against. So instead of, you can't use the language that, if I go to a dictionary and it defines racism as X and equality as Y, and you've got to make it sound like it's that language, but it's not that language. So that's where you get equity, anti-racism, and terms like that. And so they sound like, but they actually usually mean the opposite. Let's put it, I'm being, none too polite about this. CRT is sort of brash and unforgiving. So it helps to create language that is similar to, but the opposite of, but not quite the same as. And that's one of the reasons I would be suspicious. That one is suspicious about. I mean, if you mean non-racism to mean as it is defined to mean, and essentially that you don't have a prejudice towards a person by virtue of a specific characteristic. What's wrong with using that? It's because that's not what you're talking about when you're talking CRT.
I must say, I think as we head towards the end of this episode, the topic of the next episode has become very clear, and that is what social justice, with critical race theory as the sharpest point of that sword, really is doing, is taking away the idea of knowledge. It is saying that you can only have knowledge within a very specific scope of identity. I am a white male. I can only know what white males know. And I think that is such a toxic, dangerous thing. It goes against any idea of education.
Well, it's and by extension, it's a limited. You are deemed to have certain knowledge and certain knowledge only. So, for example, if you're a really good male author, you cannot write about the female or the black experience because you haven't lived it. Now, to my mind, if you're skilled and you've been observant and you have knowledge, your readers, not your CRT psychologists, but your readers will decide whether you've created an authentic character. But it's about not only what you know, but what you think, and more importantly, it's about it's about conformity. In other words, thought about how you operate in the social milieu must be within certain parameters. You do not open your mind up to thinking about something here and the opposite there, and do they meld, and should you change your mind, and is there a point being made that you haven't considered before? I mean, we're proponents of thinking anything and being exposed to any knowledge so that you can become an ultimately well-rounded, valuable human being. To my mind, I mean, one of the reasons I think CRT, one of the reasons CRT is attractive in schools is because it's a very good time to trap kids into single modes of thought, single areas of knowledge. And the worst thing about it is, if the whole experience between blacks and whites is what happened in America over 200 years, 150 years ago or longer, you are ignoring and worse, discarding, or you don't know anything about a much larger global history, some of which was as bad as worse as bad, better, whatever. But nothing is absolutely the same, and everything has different consequences. So for us to base a methodology based on slavery in America over 200 years, that's anti-knowledge. Is there such a word?
Well, if there can be anti-racism, there's certainly anti-knowledge. And I think perhaps the troubling sign-off line is for folks, watching and listening at home, is the mark of a good education and a good school system used to be, it's not who you know, it's what you are able to do. And CRT has stopped education and started indoctrination, because now it's no longer what you know, it's who you are. It's worse than nepotism, because nepotism at least isn't as selfish as social justice, with its capital S, its capital J, and its capital punishment for anyone who dares to speak out against it. And Sara, with that, we are out of time for today. And let me perhaps insert a word of encouragement before I sign off here, is if you're a young person or a parent or a teacher watching this, listening this, school level, university level, even at, in the corporate sphere where diversity training is now, replacing a lot of good vibes, speak out. And if you speak out and you get targeted, contact FAN, contact Idonti. We are here to back you up, because we really don't care about what your grandfather did, what his father did. It's time to stop this nonsense. If you want social justice with a capital S, capital J, you can follow this rabbit hole all the way down. It's rabbit holes all the way down. But if you want justice, my goodness, stick with us, stick it out. We'll be there for you, because in the end, if justice isn't about freedom, it's not justice. And your freedom is worth fighting for. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next week.